So is the defining the endpoint one of the hardest parts to get agreement on?
Well, in this particular case, it wasn't because it's pretty obvious. Okay, stop your aggression and then eject Saddam's military forces from Kuwait. That's ultimately what we wanted to do. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah.
Well,
No,
the
no,
first
no,
thing,
no,
if you
but no discussion to go into Iraq. Just simply repel.
not in terms of setting the original objectives. You raise a very good question because many of us didn't want to stop by just ejecting Saddam from Kuwait. We wanted to eliminate the problem for once and for all. And that was to get rid of Saddam and do it in 1991, not wait until 2003. But of course, we didn't know what was going to happen in 2003 in 1991, but that was a discussion later. But President Bush made it very clear, and there were very well-defined objectives in Operation Desert Storm, and that was to remove Saddam and his forces from Kuwait.
Okay. So in formulating the plan, working back to it, and then commencing the execution, what surprised you when you look back at it over all these years?
It was a surprise to many, many people, but it wasn't a surprise to myself or those of us who had put together air campaign plan. I think the surprise in the context of the rest of the world in traditional military personnel was how rapidly we were able to accomplish our objectives through the smart application of air power. And it essentially inverted the traditional use of military force. Traditionally, people think about air power in the context of supporting maneuver or land operations. And in Desert Storm, you saw a reversal of that. What you saw is air power is the principal source, not the only means. It was the key force, supported by surface operations. Surface forces basically acted as a blocking force for 90% of the campaign. Surface forces were absolutely required, again, not as the key force, but as a supporting force. And ultimately, they were required to reoccupy Kuwait. So I think that was a big surprise. The other surprise, down at a little bit, more operational or tactical level, was the value of stealth. The F-117 was the first stealth aircraft employed in large scale during Desert Storm, and its value came through loud and clear. I'm going to give you a very clear example. The F-117s only made up about 2% of the strike sorties throughout the entire operation, yet they hit over 40% of the strategic targets during the campaign. That's huge leverage.
Absolutely.
And it has follow-on implications that still exist today, because you hear it over and over again with people talking about, those stealth aircraft, they're really expensive. But they're looking at the expense in the context of a particular unit cost for a particular aircraft. They're not thinking in terms of cost per effect, which is ultimately the measure of value. Let me give you just a very quick hypothetical example. It's not really hypothetical because I can give you a real world example. And that is, the fact of the matter is, the simple example is, if that one stealth aircraft can accomplish what it would otherwise take 30 or 40 non-stealthy aircraft to accomplish, tell me which one is the most cost effective.
Absolutely.
It's
Right.
the stealthy aircraft. It's not even though those other aircraft might be, one half or one third the expense individually, collectively, since you need so many to accomplish your desired effect, the value resides with what can do the job with the least amount of resources. So that lesson still has to be hammered into people, because they have this proclivity to look at buying major weapon systems as if they were going to a grocery store and buying a can of beans, and they're looking for, a name brand can of beans or generic can of beans. Well, that's not what weapon systems are about.
So this was, David, the turning point for air power, or one of the key turning points.
That was a turning point for military operations.
Yeah.
Desert Storm was a turning point in the context that it set the expectations for modern warfare, and we've never gone back. Not just in the context of air power, but it set expectations in terms of low casualties. I mean, you want a surprise?
Yes.
Now, again, we weren't surprised, those of us who were the planners, because we put together a plan that would result in small numbers of losses. But there were many people, smart people. You had Barry McCaffrey, who was a 2-star Army general, a division commander at the time, who prior to Desert Storm went to Congress and testified that he would expect upwards of 10,000 casualties in his in the operation alone. Where, look, any loss of life is terrible, but there were fewer than 150 U.S. personnel killed in the entire operation that involved nearly 800,000 military personnel. And I dare say we planned this campaign to reduce civilian casualties of our opponent as well. The issue's not about how many people you can kill or how many things you can break. It's by getting the adversary to act in accordance with our strategic objectives with a minimal loss of life. So that was the approach that we took in designing the campaign. And so that became then the expectation for follow-on operations. It also highlighted the value of stealth. It highlighted the value of precision. Mass to a degree was offset by the ability to be very precise in the application of force. And so what you saw in Desert Storm was the realization of technology finally catching up to the expectations of early air power pioneers. Real quick example. If you go back to World War II, it took upwards of 1,000 B-17s and B-24s during the combined bomber offensive over Central Europe to hit one area target. And the reason was the accuracy of the weapons was so bad. On any given mission, you could expect that the bombs dropped from a B-17 at 25,000 feet, half of them would fall over a half a mile away from your intended target. Well, by the time we got to Desert Storm, you could hit, instead of taking 1,000 airplanes to hit one target, you had the F-117 that had 2 precision weapons on it, so you could hit multiple targets with one airplane. Because that air circle had collapsed to now less than 3 meters. And so that became a turning point. And even in Desert Storm, we only used about 6 to 8% of the munitions were precise.
Yeah, right.
Today, over 90% of the weapons that we employ are precise. But those were a couple things that, really changed in Desert Storm. It was the first time we used joint operations. In other words, the services don't fight, the combatant commands do. So we had this thing identified as a Joint Force Air Component Commander. So General Horner had control of all the air forces from whatever country or service they came out of. And as the air campaign planner, I didn't care what was printed on the side of an airplane, whether it said Navy or Marine Corps or Air Force or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or UAE or France. It's about the capability that it brought to the fight. So that's a very different perspective. And, it's still being, there's still some services who are highly resistant to the notion of jointness.
Yes.
I tell you that armies still believe that they're the queen of battle and that the only way you can accomplish your objectives is by putting your foot on the neck of your adversary with a bayonet in his neck, which is ridiculous. But unfortunately, there are still people who think that way. Jointness is about using the right force at the right place at the right time. It doesn't mean that we don't need all of the different services we do. but every campaign's different. And so what jointness means, or jointery, as some call it, is to pick the right forces to meet the needs of a particular contingency. We just saw that in the Iranian situation,
Yeah. Yep.
where it was principally using air and naval forces, not ground forces, to accomplish the stated objectives.